I feel like you all know everything there is to know about me now. That was an impressive intro. Uh, so growing up, my family had a very interesting relationship with technology. You know, I wouldn't say that we shied away from it. In fact, in certain areas, we were pretty quick to adopt it. My parents quickly upgraded their music collection to CDs when those came out. I remember getting our first DVD player shortly after those were first hitting the shelves and paying way too much money for that thing. And my dad was very skilled at moving around inside a DOS prompt and bash scripting and things like that. In fact, that's probably how I first started to get interested in computers, was watching him move around. So in some ways, we were pretty kind of on the forefront of adopting these sorts of things. But my parents were always very cautious about too much technology. It's very sad, but we weren't allowed to own video games when we were growing up. Because my parents were afraid that we were going to turn into little video game addicted zombies. And to be fair, judging by how many late nights in college I was playing massive capture the flag games on Halo, that's probably a fair concern. We didn't watch a lot of TV and movies, and when we did, we made that into a very special thing as a family. Sunday was family movie night, and my mom would pop up this giant bowl of popcorn and just smother it with salt and butter so that it was extra healthy. And then we would all sit down and we'd watch the movie together. And because this was a special thing that we did as a family, nobody could miss any of the movies. So if the phone rang, or you had to go to the kitchen to get something, or you had to go to the bathroom, we paused the movie until that person got up, did whatever they had to do, and got back. Considering I was one of 5 children, that meant that sometimes a 2-hour movie could take 4.5 hours. It was a big event these nights. But we did that because we were very careful and deliberate about making sure that nobody missed it, because it was a special thing. Everything we did was very carefully curated to make sure that we didn't consume too much. And then when we did, it was a special experience. So it's no surprise then that that's how we reacted when the internet got set up. I remember standing around as the guy was plugging in the dial-up modem and hearing those annoyingly screeching sounds coming out of there. And I was sitting there with my brothers and sisters, and we were buzzing with excitement. I mean, we would use the internet a little bit at school, right? So we knew what was on there, and we knew all the school research that we could now do at home and things like that. So we were really excited about this, and my mom saw us standing there off to the side, just brimming with enthusiasm. And I think this is where she thought, oh crap, this is how I lose them. I kept them from TVs and movies. They're not video game addicted zombies, but the internet, that's how I'm going to lose them. And so she walked over to us and she said, I just want to let you know, don't get too excited, because having the internet doesn't change anything. Because I'm a good son, I love to remind my mom of this every chance I get, because within 2 weeks, she was easily the most addicted out of all of us. She was on discussion forums and message boards and chain email and eBay, and filling her CD collection off of CD Now, which was later became Amazon or was acquired by her or something like that. I mean, you name it, she was doing it. Now, my mom is a very smart person, and I have to say that because this is being recorded and she could potentially watch this afterwards. She's very intelligent, but she was wrong about this, right? Because the internet does change things. The internet changes everything. A lot of people have compared the internet to a modern-day Library of Alexandria, but I don't think that's entirely true. In fact, I think that's selling the internet short. The internet is the single largest collection of human knowledge ever assembled. You can find everything on there, everything from ancient Greek history to calculus lessons to videos of cats fighting each other with lightsabers. It's all there. And thanks to the advent of the mobile phone, we walk around with access to the sum of whole human knowledge in our pocket, available at a moment's notice. And that's incredibly powerful. That's incredibly important. In fact, in 2012, the United Nations adopted a resolution that stated that access to the internet and the information it contains is a human right worth protecting and preserving. People depend on it for information, for jobs, for general news, for commerce. There's so many important uses of the web. This information is extremely valuable, and that's particularly true for people that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty tries to target with their sites. Their whole purpose, their whole reason that this site exists is to try and reach people in areas where information is meant to be bottled up and controlled, not opened up and shared freely. Places like Iran, where very recently a Grand Ayatollah stated that high-speed connections like 3G are against human and moral standards. In countries like Iran, they actually frequently throttle the connections because it's a way of controlling the information by basically shutting it down, not allowing it to flow at all. You know, in places like this, the web becomes a battleground and speed becomes a primary weapon in that battle. It's a weapon for controlling the flow of information through throttling and things like that, and it's a weapon for opening that information back up through proxy browsers and advanced performance techniques. And if you think that that's like over the top, that's a little overly dramatic, this idea of the web as a battleground and speed as a weapon in the battle, unfortunately it's not. When we went for the kickoff meeting on this project, you know, we were pretty excited, those of us coming from the US that were working on this. You know, this was going to be a very challenging project, very fun. It was something to sink our teeth into that we didn't get to do every day. And so we were pretty loose and pumped. And during the kickoff meeting, somebody from the Radio Free team told us that in many countries, accessing the information on the sites that Radio Free serves is punishable by death. You could be hung simply for trying to read the information that they're trying to provide to these people. And I tell you, that changed the way we looked at this project dramatically. I mean, we went from being like, it was kind of like you could feel the air collectively getting sucked right out of us, because that's a huge responsibility. When people are putting their lives on the line to try and access the information your site is providing, you better be damn sure you're going to get that content to them, no matter the device and no matter the network. So that's what we did. That was the goal. That was the stakes we were playing with when we worked with the Pangea team, which is the internal team at RFE that does the CMS that powers all of their sites. It's about a 20-person team. These were the key members that we worked directly with. And then myself, and then Dan Mall and Matt Cook of Super Friendly. And we set out to make a responsive site that was going to work no matter the device and no matter the network. Now, once we kind of understood the gravity of the situation, we wanted to take a step back and get a better picture of what we were up against. So we turned to bandwidth data from Akamai to try and figure out what networks were like in some of these countries. And we plotted these out, and predictably, there's quite a bit of variance here, which we were expecting to see. But one of the interesting things that came out of this very quick little bit of research was a problem that I think is very evident in our industry, which is that our internet is not their internet. If you look back at this, the two teams working on this project, we were in the US and Canada, the two places with by far and away the best connections out of everybody. In fact, compared to some of the countries we were going to be reaching, like Iran and Pakistan, we were sitting at nearly 10 times the bandwidth on average. It was a dramatically different situation. The way we were experiencing the web had nothing like the way that our users were going to be experiencing it. And this is a problem, because what do we do with new devices and better connection speeds, right? We fill them up. That's what we do. We take advantage of them and throw more things on those sites. You know, every time that I give a presentation that I have the average weight of a site in the slide deck, I always make sure that I check right before walking on stage, because it's probably gone up about 30 or 40K. We're looking at over 2 megs now on the average site, which highlights another problem in a lot of these areas, and that's the cost of this data. I apologize for the slightly smaller font, but this is looking at the cost of loading up an average site on a mobile connection in a variety of different countries. And this is looking at it as a percentage of the daily GNI per capita, so the daily income per person, basically. And in some places, they're spending as much as 7 to 8% of their daily income on one average site, which makes it all the more painful when you see something like an 80 megabyte or 60 megabyte sites that get released and people open these things up. And unfortunately, there's no warning ahead of time that this is going to be a 60 to 80 meg site and it's going to cost you a ton of money. You know, digging deeper into the network situation in these areas is very interesting and very revealing. In Indonesia, 75% of the population is on 2G or old GSM edge networks. Right? These are slow connections. In Iran again, 3G penetration after 2 years of being released had hit 0.1%. 2 years it had been there, and it had 0.1% penetration. Fixed broadband wasn't much better at about 16%. This is an article from when Pakistan first auctioned off the rights for their network operators to start building 3G connections. And they were talking about how exciting it was that they were going to get these high-speed connections, what they were going to do with them. But note the date. That's April of 2014 and they're just getting the right to start building these networks. And based on what we saw from Iran, it could take quite a while for those things to take off. One of my favorite quotes is commonly attributed to William Gibson. The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And if I had it my way, this thing would be put on a poster and slapped on the wall of everybody working on the web, because it's such an incredibly important, valuable lesson to be aware of and to learn. We talk about the high-speed connections in these powerful browsers and these powerful devices, but the reality is that not everybody is on those things. This is something that a lot of companies are starting to become aware of. Facebook just the other year went down to Nigeria to try and experience what it was like to use Facebook under these sorts of conditions. And when they got there, they were kind of startled. They weren't expecting what they found, which is that basic fundamental things about the app were completely broken. Uploading a photo, simple, trivial little things just did not work. So when they came back, the project manager said, you know what, that was a really harsh experience for us. We'd been building an app for users like us, but we were the exception, not the rule. Our internet is not their internet, and because of that, we can't risk performance. We have to become performant by default. We need to prioritize performance from the very beginning, and so that's what we tried to do with this project. So we started off by setting a performance budget. Now, for anybody not familiar, performance budget's just like a monetary budget or anything like that. You set a limit on your site for whether that's weight or load time or whatever it happens to be, and you decide that your pages are not going to go over that budget. So what we did is we looked at the analytics and we saw that their traffic was dominantly mobile, and it came from two primary templates. It came from their homepage and it came from articles. So we grabbed an article that was fairly representative of what a typical article page was like, and we grabbed their homepage. And we loaded these things up over really slow 3G connections, something kind of in the middle of what people were going to probably be experiencing as an average. And to calculate the budget, we turned to a tool called Web Page Test Bulk Tester, which is created by Andy Davies. It's a Google Docs spreadsheet with some formulas and things in there. And you define which URLs you want to test. You define a web page test scenario, like we want to test it over Chrome on this speed, or we want to test it over IE on this speed. And then you have it run the test, and it will go through however many URLs you have listed, and as those tests complete, it comes back and it fills in that data, depending on what you asked to get back. So we asked for things like speed index and start render time and visually complete, and then we had a link so we could dig deeper if we needed to. So we did this for these two templates across 5 different radio-free properties, and we did this for 6 to 7, well, not really competitors, they don't really have competitors, but similar sites like Al Jazeera and CNN and BBC and things like that. And then from there, we tried to come at some sort of a target. And to do this, which was, by the way, another advantage of the spreadsheet, we just had it automatically do the math, yay for no math. To do this, we turned to something called the 20% rule, which was introduced by Stephen Seow in his book, Designing and Engineering Time. The 20% rule states that people notice a difference in interface time when that difference exceeds 20%. So if you want to be faster than your current site and you want people to notice that, you can't be 10% faster. You have to be at least 20% faster, or else they're probably not going to notice. You want to beat a competitor, you have to be 20% faster than that competitor. So we came up with our targets based on this 20% rule. And after kind of fiddling with it a little bit, what we came up with was visually complete in less than or equal to 4,000 milliseconds. This was the target that would let us hit that 20% rule, but it was also, honestly, a fairly conservative target. This was our target over a semi-poor 3G network. But anybody in the crowd who's really, a big performance advocate is probably like, that's not that fast. And that's fair. That's fair. It's not that fast. But has anybody ever climbed the really tall, skinny tower, the 2 towers, things that you guys have here in Bologna? Has anybody climbed up that? All right, I did that. After a day of walking around Bologna, and I was kind of maybe a little too arrogant, and I walked in there in my boat shoes with no socks, which was a horrible idea. And I'm like, I'm going to walk these 500 steps. And I feel like I'm a fairly well-fit individual, kind of in condition. So they're in their tiny little steps. I don't know who they built this for, but they had tiny little feet, whoever they built this thing for. And I have big feet, so I decided I was going to go like 2 or 3 steps at a time. because it was going to be a little easier to stretch the legs. And I did that for maybe for just a couple flights, and my legs were burning, and I had sweat dripping, and I think everybody walking down was looking at me like, oh, he's so gross. I mean, it was horrible. And so I quickly had to switch to one step at a time. Right? And it didn't get me there quite as fast as I had anticipated, but at least I got there versus collapsing partway up. Anytime you're trying to influence some sort of meaningful change inside of an organization, any sort of cultural change, that happens over a course of baby steps. It doesn't happen all at once. It's something that takes a process. It takes time. And while there was a very smart team at Radio Free Europe, you wouldn't exactly say that they had a huge performance culture yet. So we wanted to start with a target that was very achievable. We wanted to have something that was winnable that they could then celebrate and start to build up that momentum. You know, this is something Etsy does very, very well and talks about all the time. They have these alerts about performance improvements, and whenever a performance improvement occurs, they celebrate it. They get donuts for the person. They take a picture of them and they slap them up on a dashboard. They really take this to heart, this idea of celebrating every single win within their organization. And I love that because that's how you make change, right? You celebrate all the little small victories along the way. So we went fairly conservative on the budget. But even with that, it was immediate, like the effect of having this performance budget set up front. We could see how that translated to our process right off the gate. So one of the first deliverables we provided was something called an element collage. And this is one of these genius ideas from Dan Mall. And the idea is instead of providing a template or getting people to focus on specific pages, you provide this huge document that has just different pieces, different components that you might use throughout the site or application. It's basically a way of playing around with some of the feel and look and seeing how things are going to play together without getting confined into a specific page type. And this is one of the very first deliverables we provided, but already Dan was considering the performance budget when he was looking at this. So for one, you know, Dan is very strong typographic skills. I'm not going to talk about it because I'm going to offend somebody by confusing type and font, and people are going to walk out. But it's important, and especially for a site like this where the content is dominantly articles, it's a very important feature of that site. And so we wanted to do something nice with the type. We wanted to include some nice web fonts. But unfortunately, as you all know, web fonts. So right away in this first deliverable, what Dan was doing was playing around with a web font and then what would be a similar font, like a font that had a similar feel or a similar X height that we could fall back to that would be more broadly supported. So if we were in a situation where the connectivity wasn't great or web fonts weren't supported, we would have a fairly seamless fallback. The performance also came into play in the article and how he was comping up how an article page might look at different levels. How it might look on a phone, like a core experience over a slow network, how it might look when slightly enhanced, how it might look as it got larger. You know, and you can see on the core experience, he's like, well, maybe it's just a text link and we don't have to worry about the image or video being embedded and we can kind of enhance as it goes up. So the performance budget was influencing our design from the very beginning. Now, we also wanted it to influence our development, so we were using Grunt for the build tool. So I wrote a little grunt perf budget, a little task based on the web page test API that would let us check our site as we were developing every time we built against our predefined budget. So every time we went to do a formal build, what it would do is it would test the pages we defined against the budget we defined on web page test. And when the test came back, it would either pass or fail. And if it failed, it would break the entire build. We could not push up and deploy if we hadn't met our budget. You know, and other organizations have talked about including this inside of their continuous deployment environments with very similar effects. Like you break the build. It's a very harsh way of ensuring that performance is enforced, but boy, you can't make the mistake of pushing something too fat or heavy up because it's impossible. It just doesn't work. And we also wanted it to influence our day-to-day decisions. So we built the site using something that Brad Frost and Dave Olson created called Pattern Lab. It's a fantastic little tool. You start by building up these little atoms and like individual little pieces like a button, and then maybe it's a form, and then it continues to get bigger and bigger until you finally have a page. You're including these different components everywhere. And there's this bar across the top on every single page and pattern that you load up when you're working inside of Pattern Lab. So we wrote just a little bit of JavaScript to check that page, whatever that happened to be that was loading, against our budget. Now, we went more aggressive, by the way, on this budget because typically we were working over a high-speed connection. So for this, we were looking at 1,000 milliseconds. But we tested our budget against this. So every single time that we made a change to the HTML or the CSS or the JavaScript, or we added a new image, immediately inside the browser, we'd get this either green flag that said, yeah, you're doing great, or it would turn red, which meant that we were not keeping our budget. It's a small little thing, but it's a way of sort of nudging you in that right direction. Like, you can't ignore the performance because it's always there right in front of you. And the added benefit is we got to see this by components. So we could load up a carousel or a photo gallery and see right away how that was doing compared to our budget. And maybe there was a certain pattern that was causing issues, and then dig deeper into figuring out why that was. In addition to this, we wanted to kind of feel what the users were going to be feeling. Numbers are great, and we talk a lot about them in performance, but honestly, you have to feel it sometimes to really kind of recognize what does it mean if you're visually complete in 6,000 milliseconds instead of 4,000. So I'm all about embracing the pain, becoming a performance masochist. I always say that we should have a T-shirt for something like that, and nobody's ever taken me up on it. Like, I don't know, it seems like a catchy little slogan. So while we were developing, what we would do is we would frequently throttle our connection. We'd use something like Network Link Conditioner, or there used to be an app called Slowy. They got kind of, I think they stopped doing that now. There's a variety of different applications you can use to do this. We set up a connection that was a bad 3G connection based on what we were testing our budget against, and we would throttle the connection and then work on this for a few hours and load up the patterns and load up the pages while we were using this horrible, horrible internet connection. And I got to tell you, it's not great for productivity. Like, don't do this every day, every week. It's a horrible idea. But it really does open your eyes to the decisions that you're making along the way in terms of performance. It really does. So this is how we were using the budget and sort of these tools to kind of influence our development environment. And we also wanted to make sure that we weren't risking anything and leaving anything to chance. In Italy, is anybody aware of the concept of the easy button? Is that a thing here? Okay, so in the US, there's a series of commercials from like an office supply store. They have this easy button. Basically, somebody sits down and, I don't know, they're having problems using a stapler or something. Something's difficult, and they press this big red button that says easy, and then the office supply company magically produces what they needed exactly how they needed it. It's the idea of it could be magically done for you. Build tools and automation is kind of the easy button of performance. It's a way of sort of ensuring that all that low-hanging fruit, all those little things that can like influence the performance of your site, get taken care of regardless of whether or not you remember to do it. And look, I mean, we human beings we're very smart, we're very clever. We've done some really fantastic things, honestly, over time. However, we are also the same species that decided that fanny packs were so cool that even The Rock decided that he was going to be wearing these things very proudly. And we're the same species that decided that, you know what, disco is acceptable. Not only acceptable, disco is an awesome kind of music and dance, I question that decision as well. And we're also the species that said, you know what, it would be so cool to have our very own pet rock that we bought 1.6 million of them in the first 6 months that they were available. I know, right? That's a lot of rocks. I remember making pet rocks out of the stuff we'd find in the driveway. We kept it cheap. Anyway, the point being that we've been known to make a mistake or two, right? And you can't make a mistake when it comes to performance, especially when you're trying to reach a global audience. You just cannot risk it. Now, all the things I'm about to mention are grunt tasks because we were using grunt. This is not a grunt ad. I've used gulp. I've seen organizations use ant and fing. I've seen incredible things with make. It doesn't really matter what build tool you have. You can do this. You just pick whatever works best for your team. We just happen to use grunt. But we used it to automate away all of this low-hanging fruit. So what we did with it, we did things like compressing images using the ImageMin task. This same task allowed us to convert JPEGs to progressive JPEGs so that they would load in bit by bit so you could see a little bit better perception of performance. It turned out that there was a little flag inside of the configuration where you just told it to make the JPEG compressed or progressive, and it did that automatically for you. So every image that got added to the site immediately had all the excess weight and baggage stripped off of it. We used it to concatenate and minimize the JavaScript using concat and uglify. Again, things that we didn't want to have to manually do or could become tedious if you try to do it manually. We used it to eliminate unnecessary CSS. Like, we didn't use something like Bootstrap or anything like that. We were using our own our own ad hoc sort of CSS that we developed, but we still wanted to run this because, again, being human, we knew that there was going to be times where we would build a pattern, go back and refactor the pattern, and we may forget to pull out some of that CSS that we no longer needed. So by running this, we could make sure that we were saving those extra bytes from ever getting passed out to the user, just because we had forgot to pull them out. We inline the critical CSS sets, the idea of taking the CSS that applies to the portion of the screen that is immediately visible and shoving it right inside of that first response, inline inside of the HTML, so that as soon as the browser gets that first response back, it can paint something out onto the screen very quickly. For this, we used Grunt Penthouse, and you basically set up by setting in different template types, and then the CSS for those template types, and you set a width and a height that you want it to base that viewport on, and it would calculate the inline CSS, and then we'd inject it into the page. I will say that now I'm a much bigger fan of using Grunt Critical CSS from Filament Group. I think it seems to do a slightly better job. It also feels a little bit more friendly to use. But Penthouse is what we used on this project. We used SVG a lot on this site, and so we minimized all the SVG files that went in there. But we knew we were going to do this because of a couple reasons. First off, the web font issue that I mentioned earlier. Secondly, proxy browser use is huge in a lot of these markets, and proxy browsers do not support icon fonts. You're not going to do icons using icon fonts on those things. And also, icon fonts can frankly be kind of unpredictable, as Etsy discovered when a user kind of came in and said, "Why is there a horse showing up as the 5th star of my reviews?" It turned out that there was a, it looked like this. There was a glyph missing inside the font file, and so it was just, for whatever reason, injecting the horse emoji instead. I don't know how you make that happen. So everybody was getting these 4 and a horse star reviews. And it's funny because you read the thread and some people are loving the 4 and a horse star. People like me who love bad puns were like, this is fantastic. And there were a couple people that were like, well, this is, I don't want a horse on my reviews. Icon fonts can be unpredictable. And we also saw really big performance benefits for SVG. So we took one of the SVG files that we had, and we just ran it through a series of optimizations step by step to see what exactly happens and how much weight does this SVG file end up taking up. So we started off with like 10,000 bytes. And then we rounded the decimal place to 1 to see what we would get improvement by shaving off those extra decimal places inside of the SVG file. Then we merged the paths. We combined all the different paths into a singular path whenever possible. And then we ran SVGO, which optimized it and compressed it. And then we turned on gzip. So by the time it was done, we had taken this 10,000 byte icon and turned it into 1,000 bytes. We had a savings of about 87%, which is not bad. That's not bad. And it turns out that every single step of these optimizations can be done inside of SVG min, the task. You can tell it to clean up the numeric values and have a different precision for your decimal points. You can have it combine paths, although I don't recommend doing that automatically. We found that there were some issues sometimes, so we did that part of it manually. But the rest of it, the compression and the rounding of the decimal places, were automated for us. And the result was pretty good. We had about, we also put these inside of a sprite, basically. An SVG sprite. So we're using SVG Store that would take each individual icon and pull it into a sprite and inject that into the page. And then we would use it throughout the page, just kind of like this. So this was your sprite. Each icon had its own symbol with an ID. Like this case was add to list. And inside of that symbol was the actual SVG needed for that icon. And then later in the page, we would pull it in using this, just saying use, and then referring to the ID of that sprite. And we ended up with about 20 icons that we were using on some of the prior key templates that ended up being about 2.5K for 20 icons. Pretty tiny, and you're not going to match that with an icon font. That's about 125 bytes per SVG file icon, by the way, for people who are trying to do the calculations inside their head. We also, using the SVG Store, we were also able to do all these prefixes automatically. So we could have the icon be saved add to list, and it would add the shape add to list and things like that. So we literally had nothing to do other than export the SVG file from Illustrator or whatever else we happened to create it in. And that's the benefit of the whole automation process, is that you basically get to set it, and then forget it. You do this one time at the beginning of your project, and then you never think about these optimizations again. That's the benefit of a build process or an automation tool. It raises the floor on performance. It takes care of all the little things that would get lost in the shuffle, so you don't have to worry about it. So you can focus on the more interesting challenges. And there's a lot more interesting challenges to try and tackle. When we looked at the analytics for Radio Free, we wanted to see what the common devices were. This is what we found that dominated. These were these old, horrible Nokia devices, things that we would barely call a smartphone. Things like this one, which has no 3G connectivity, no Wi-Fi connectivity, no touchscreen, 240 pixel widescreen, and 64 megabytes of internal memory. This is not a powerful device, but it's a cheap device. And it gets the job done. So it's extremely popular. And I'm not cherry picking from down the list. This was number 1 or number 2 in about 10 different countries that we were looking at. Is anybody a science, like a space fan, or you've seen the movie Apollo 13? Yeah, there's a few hands up, right? The Apollo 13 mission was like this disastrous thing that nearly came to horrible conclusions many times. And one of the scenes that they portrayed really well in the movie was this situation where the CO2 levels were reaching very dangerous numbers. And they needed to find a way to fit this square lithium hydroxide canister into this round opening. And so in the movie, what they did to portray this, and they came in with this big garbage bag that represented everything on the shuttle, dumped it onto the table, and he dramatically pointed out, we need to make this fit in there with this stuff. And they did it, spoiler alert, they did it, and, sorry. They pulled it off, but boy, was it a hack. I mean, it was like duct tape and things like that, and it was this horrible looking thing in the end. And I think that we do a lot of this on the web. We take this like fully featured site with all of its bells and its whistles, and we try to cram it onto these older, less capable browsers and devices. And to do that, we throw all these polyfills and frameworks for everything at it. Right? This is basically how we spend a lot of time building our sites. I'm a big fan of the cutting the mustard approach that BBC came up with. To me, cutting the mustard is how you get that square canister into that round opening. The idea of cutting the mustard is that you have some sort of a baseline, and you say if you achieve this baseline, you're a modern browser, you're going to get our fully booted app. If you don't achieve this baseline, we're going to give you a core experience. You're still going to get your content, but it's going to be far more usable and helpful for you. And the most common way of doing it is basically looking for 3 things. It's this query selector and document, local storage in window, and add event listener in window. Primarily because query selector and add event listener are things that are very common inside of, a common reason for why you would use something like jQuery and things like that. But if you've got that standardized support for it, you probably don't necessarily need to use that framework, or you can rely a little bit on a little bit more vanilla JavaScript if you want. And then you basically do this check. And then if this check passes, you say it cuts the mustard. So we would set an object to true, and we'd put a class name on side of the document so that we could style everything accordingly. So if it didn't meet this pass, they got this basic core experience that was really lightweight. And if it did, then we'd pull in everything. We'd load the JavaScript and the CSS for the full application asynchronously using load CSS and load JS, which are 2 itty-bitty little scripts from the filament group again, that you can inline within your page. They're that tiny, and they'll pull those things in for you. But this freed us up a lot. This allowed us to go vanilla on the JavaScript. Like, we wanted to see if we could do this without a framework. Now, we weren't sure if we could pull it off, so we started by using something that really mimicked the jQuery syntax, because we wanted to know that if 5 months down the line we figured out we had to use jQuery, we weren't going to have to redo everything. But it ended up that we didn't have to do that. We were able to do this purely vanilla and build it up as we go. And the benefits were pretty substantial. What we were looking at the time was jQuery 2.1.1, which was about 30,000 bytes, minimized and compressed. And the entire JavaScript for the Radio Free sites ended up being about a little under 12,000. So we saw about a 60% improvement by going vanilla. And this isn't just download time, but this is parsing and execution. There's recently been a lot of chatter online about like how much memory these JavaScript files are taking up within the browsers right now. So this is a fairly substantial thing to improve on. And I know I want to make it clear, I'm not anti-framework. I'm not saying never use jQuery or anything like that. I use those frameworks a lot. But think consciously about it, because sometimes you can get away without it, and if you can get some pretty significant benefits from it. So this approach, this cutting the mustard approach, really allowed us to improve dynamic range, which is an interesting stat to look at when you're looking at reaching a global audience. Dynamic range is the ratio between the highest and lowest values of a changeable quantity. So in the context of global performance, it goes something like this. Ronan Kremen from MobiForge wrote this post where he was trying to figure out how much do the top 10 sites adjust for different devices and different networks. So he'd load up a site on a poor Nokia device, an iPhone, a tablet, and a desktop. And he wanted to find out what was the smallest weight of that site and what was the largest weight. And then the difference between the two, like the factor of the difference, is the dynamic range. That should tell you how much are they doing to adjust the performance of their site. So over the top 10, the median was about 27.5, was the factor, 27.5. So they're doing quite a bit, actually, to try and make their sites accommodate these different devices. Now, I know this is a knock on performance, by the way, or responsive design is the performance issue, right? It can't perform well, it can respond to screen types, but it can't respond to device types and things like that. Well, that's not exactly what we found. When we ended up with this thing, we measured it all, and our core experience was 22K in 4 requests. Our small was 418, and our large was 781. Now, disclaimer, they're still in the process of rolling this out bit by bit, so by the time this is fully out, these numbers could be different. But what we saw with a fully functioning radio-free site that we developed at the end of it was a factor of 35 was our dynamic range, well above the median for the top 10. So we found no reason to believe that responsive design can't handle performance. So the next time somebody tells you that, you can tell them to go to no. You can tell them no. So this is important, and I think these techniques, the cutting the mustard and things, are going to be increasingly important, because if we're not battling this global scale already, we're going to be doing it pretty soon. This is a map showing internet population and penetration around the globe. The darker the shade of the country, that means the higher saturation. So people in the Western world, we've pretty much hit peak, right? We're at 80, 90% internet penetration. The lighter shaded countries, those are the places where there's a lot of room for growth. Those are places like Indonesia and India and Africa and China, all of these different markets. That's where the next boom of internet users is going to come from. In fact, 95% of the people who are offline in the world live in these sort of developing countries. 95%. That's where we're going to get our growth, is from these markets that have a lot more in common with places like Iran and Pakistan than they do with Italy or the United States or anywhere else in Europe. And it's tempting sometimes to think, well, yeah, why would my company need to reach somebody in Africa? Why do I need to worry about somebody in Iran, right? I mean, it's a totally different situation. But there was this great post recently about the African internet evolution, and the author kind of summed it up by saying, you know what, we think that the internet story here is going to be no different from the rest of the world. I mean, we listen to music, we watch movies, we play games. We do all the same things that you're doing in the Western world. We want access to all of those things. The conditions change, but the use cases don't, not substantially. It's a common thing nowadays, excuse me, a very popular thing apparently, to claim that the internet is dead, the web is dead. You see posts all the time, don't we, about the internet is dying. It's all apps. There was an article where Flipkart, this company in India, decided that it wasn't going to do a mobile site, it was going to do an app because the mobile web couldn't handle all these different performance situations, and that caused John Gruber to come out and say, well, yeah, the web is only good for what it was originally intended for, simple little documents, and for everything else, it can't do it. It's ill-equipped, which, I mean, let's ignore the kind of absurdity of claiming that a medium that's 20, 25 years old and has been working on devices that didn't exist when it was invented and networks that didn't exist when it was invented is suddenly now unable to adapt. But if we put that aside for a second, here's the thing. The web is as fast as we choose to make it. Right? The web is not inherently slow. It's only slow if that's what we do. And every single project that we're working on, we are making choices throughout the entire project that are determining how fast or how slow that site is going to be. We make the web fast or we make it slow. We can choose. We can choose to be performant by default and set those checks and balances and make sure that we've raised the floor. We can choose to bridge the gap between these modern devices and these lower powered devices that may be more typical technology, to be quite honest. These are all choices, and they're important choices because for many people around the world, performance dictates access. If it's a well-performing site, they can get online, and if they can't, if it's not, they don't get that information. That's an important choice to make. The internet does change everything. The internet provides information, it provides jobs, it provides commerce, it provides tremendous value for the businesses. The internet changes everything. And we can choose to make a web that is going to work for everybody, or we can choose to leave those people out. So let's choose wisely. Thank you.